The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Rosemary's kitchen like impatient fingers, each drop catching the warm amber light that spilled from the small restaurant onto the wet pavement of Millbrook's Main Street. Inside, the evening service was winding down with the familiar rhythm that had defined Elena Rodriguez's life for the past 8 years. The sizzle of onions in cast iron, the gentle clatter of plates being cleared, the soft murmur of satisfied customers. These sounds had become the soundtrack of her existence in this small Vermont town where everyone knew your name and your story. Elena moved through her kitchen with the fluid grace of someone who had found her calling. At 34, she possessed the kind of confidence that came not from arrogance, but from years of quiet mastery. Her hands, scarred from countless burns and cuts, worked with an economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory and deep love for her craft. She had arrived in Millbrook 9 years earlier, a young woman with haunted eyes and a battered suitcase, carrying nothing but her grandmother's wooden spoon and a head full of recipes that seemed to hold the warmth of a dozen different kitchens. The townspeople had watched her transform the abandoned storefront on Main Street into something magical. Rosemary's Kitchen wasn't just a restaurant. It was a gathering place where the lonely found company, where the grieving found comfort, and where the lost found themselves again. Elena had an uncanny ability to know exactly what someone needed before they ordered. A steaming bowl of pozole for the homesick, her famous apple cinnamon bread for the heartbroken, or simply a listening ear for those who needed to talk. On this particular Thursday evening in late October 2008, Elena was preparing for what would become known as her last service, though no one could have predicted the mystery that would unfold. The dining room held its usual mix of regulars. Old Mr. Thompson nursing his third cup of coffee while working on the crossword puzzle, the Morrison family celebrating their daughter's acceptance to college, and Sarah Chen, the local librarian, sitting alone at table 7 with a book propped against the salt shaker. Elena makes the best tres leches cake this side of the Mexican border, Mrs. Patterson was telling her visiting sister, loud enough for the kitchen to hear. And those empanadas, Lord have mercy, they're like little pockets of heaven. Eleanor smiled to herself as she plated the last dessert of the evening. She had always been amazed by how food could bridge the gaps between people, how a shared meal could turn strangers into friends and friends into family. In Millbrook, she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a home. The kitchen began its nightly transformation as Elena and her small staff, just 2 part-time servers and a dishwasher, moved through the closing routine. Every surface was wiped down, every pot scrubbed until it gleamed, every ingredient properly stored. Elena was meticulous about her kitchen, treating it with the reverence others reserved for sacred spaces. She believed that the energy you put into caring for your workspace would return to you in the food you created. As the last customer left and the staff headed home, Elena remained behind, as was her custom. She liked the quiet that settled over the restaurant after closing, the way the kitchen seemed to exhale after a day of service. She would often spend these solitary hours experimenting with new recipes, adjusting familiar ones, or simply sitting in the dining room with a cup of tea, planning the next day's specials. But tonight felt different. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, like the moment before a storm when the air grows heavy with possibility. She had been having vivid dreams lately, dreams of kitchens she had never seen, of recipes written in handwriting she didn't recognize, of voices calling her name from very far away. The dreams always ended the same way, with her standing in a vast, empty kitchen, holding a blank recipe book that somehow felt impossibly heavy in her hands. She dismissed these thoughts as the product of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Running a restaurant single-handedly was exhausting work, and she had been pushing herself hard lately, staying up late to perfect a new sauce or rising early to bake bread from scratch. The dreams were probably just her subconscious processing the stress. At 11:47 p.m., Elena locked the front door of Rosemary's Kitchen for what would be the last time. The October night was crisp and clear, the earlier rain having washed the air clean. She walked the 3 blocks to her small apartment above the antique shop, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Millbrook rolled up its sidewalks early, and by midnight, the town was usually fast asleep. Her apartment was spare but comfortable, decorated with the kind of thoughtful touches that revealed someone who valued quality over quantity. A few carefully chosen books, a comfortable reading chair by the window, plants that somehow thrived under her care despite her busy schedule. The kitchen was her pride and joy, small but perfectly organized, with professional-grade knives and copper pots that caught the light like burnished gold. Elena made herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her chair with the notebook she had been using to develop new recipes. As she flipped through the pages, she paused at an entry she had written just days before. "Sometimes I feel like I'm remembering things that haven't happened yet, like there's a part of me that knows something I don't." She had crossed out the words almost immediately, embarrassed by the romantic notion, but now she traced them with her finger, wondering what had prompted such an unusual thought. The last thing Elena Rodriguez wrote in her notebook was a shopping list for the next day. Flour, butter, sage, apples, cinnamon, vanilla. Simple ingredients that would have become something extraordinary in her hands. She left the notebook open on the kitchen counter, the pen still uncapped beside it, as if she had been interrupted mid-thought. By morning, Elena Rodriguez had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of rosemary that seemed to cling to everything she had touched. The mystery of her disappearance would haunt Millbrook for years to come, but the strangest part of the story was yet to unfold. The first person to realize something was wrong was Danny Morrison, Elena's dishwasher, and the closest thing she had to family in Millbrook. He arrived at Rosemary's Kitchen at 8 a.m. on Friday morning, expecting to find Elena already deep in preparation for the lunch rush. Instead, he found the restaurant locked and dark, no sign of the usual morning activity that breathed life into the space. Danny stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, checking his watch and peering through the windows. Elena had never been late, not once in the 2 years he had worked for her. She was as reliable as sunrise, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. When his calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail, a cold dread began to settle in his stomach. Sheriff Robert Hayes had been hoping for a quiet Friday morning when Danny burst through the door of the police station, his face flushed with worry and exertion. "Something's happened to Elena," he said without preamble. "She's not at the restaurant, and she's not answering her phone." Hayes, a methodical man who had been keeping the peace in Millbrook for 15 years, tried to maintain his professional calm. "Maybe she's sick," he suggested, "or had a family emergency." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they didn't ring true. Elena Rodriguez didn't have family, at least none that anyone in Millbrook knew about, and in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, someone would have heard if she was planning to travel. The sheriff's knock on Elena's apartment door echoed through the empty hallway above the antique shop. When no one answered, Mrs. Kellerman, the shop owner, reluctantly provided the spare key. "She's never missed a day of work," Mrs. Kellerman said, her voice tight with concern. "Not even when she had the flu last winter." The apartment was exactly as Eleanor had left it, neat, organized, and somehow expectant, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, wallet and keys inside. Her car was still parked in its usual spot behind the building. The bed was made, but the sheets were cool to the touch, suggesting she had been gone for hours. What struck everyone who entered the apartment was how untouched it seemed. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of hasty packing, no evidence of foul play. It was as if Elena had simply decided to disappear, leaving behind everything that connected her to the physical world. The only thing that seemed out of place was the notebook on the counter, still open to that final shopping list, the pen beside it dried out from being left uncapped. Sheriff Hayes launched the most thorough missing person investigation in Millbrook's history. He interviewed every regular customer, every person who had been in the restaurant that Thursday night, every neighbor who might have seen something unusual. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was well-liked but essentially mysterious, someone who had shared her cooking but never truly shared herself. She was kind but private, Sarah Chen, the librarian, told the sheriff. She'd ask about your life, remember details about your family, but if you asked about hers, she'd just smile and change the subject. The search expanded beyond the town limits. Volunteers combed the nearby woods, dragged the pond at Miller's farm, searched abandoned buildings and old mine shafts. The state police brought in tracking dogs, but they lost Elena's scent after just a few hundred yards, as if she had vanished into thin air. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to reveal just how little anyone really knew about Elena Rodriguez. She had arrived in Millbrook with impeccable references, but when authorities tried to verify her background, they found gaps and inconsistencies. The culinary school she claimed to have attended had no record of her enrollment. Previous employers either didn't remember her or had gone out of business. It was as if her life had begun the day she arrived in Vermont. The discovery that Elena Rodriguez might not even be her real name sent shockwaves through the community. The woman they had all come to love and depend on had been living among them under what appeared to be a carefully constructed identity. The revelation raised uncomfortable questions. Who had they really known? And why had she felt the need to hide her true self? The FBI was brought in to investigate the possibility of identity theft or witness protection, but they found no evidence of either. Elena's fingerprints weren't in any database, her social security number led to a dead end, and her past remained stubbornly opaque. She had managed to create a life for herself that was both completely real and completely mysterious. If stories like this resonate with you, you might find yourself drawn to the deeper mysteries we explore here. There's something profound about the spaces people leave behind, isn't there? As winter settled over Millbrook, the search efforts gradually wound down. The restaurant remained closed, its windows dark and newspaper covered. The apartment above the antique shop was sealed as potential evidence, though evidence of what, no one could say. The town settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that comes after a tragedy when people don't know how to move forward. But Elena's disappearance had left more than just an empty restaurant and unanswered questions. It had left a hole in the community's heart, a space where warmth and comfort had once lived. Regular customers found themselves driving past the dark storefront, slowing down as if they might glimpse her familiar figure moving through the kitchen. The Morrison family still ordered tres leches cake for birthdays, but it was never quite the same. Mrs. Patterson, who had been coming to Rosemary's Kitchen every Tuesday for 3 years, summed up the town's feelings. It's like losing a piece of yourself that you didn't even know was there until it was gone. As the first anniversary of Elena's disappearance approached, Sheriff Hayes made one final push to solve the case. He re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, and reached out to federal agencies for assistance. But the trail had gone cold, and the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. The official file was never closed, but it was moved to inactive status, joining the small collection of unsolved cases that every police department accumulates over the years. Elena Rodriguez, if that was indeed her name, had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. Yet somehow the story was far from over. In the sealed apartment above the antique shop, something impossible was beginning to happen. The notebook that Elena had left open on the counter, the one with the shopping list and the crossed-out words about remembering things that hadn't happened yet, was slowly beginning to fill itself with new content. The first entry appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 5 months after Eleanor's disappearance. Written in handwriting that was unmistakably hers, but in ink that hadn't been there the day before, were the words, "The secret to perfect bread is in the waiting. Time is the ingredient most people forget." Nobody knew it yet, but the most extraordinary chapter of Elena Rodriguez's story was about to begin. 9 years had passed since Elena Rodriguez vanished from Millbrook, Vermont, and the town had learned to live with the absence. The storefront that had housed Rosemary's Kitchen became a small bookshop, then a candle store, then stood empty again. Each new business seemed to carry the weight of what had come before, as if the space itself remembered the warmth that had once filled it. Mrs. Kellerman, now in her 70s, still owned the antique shop below Elena's former apartment. She had grown accustomed to the questions from the occasional true crime enthusiast or curious visitor who had heard about the vanishing chef of Millbrook. The story had gained a small following online, becoming one of those internet mysteries that people discussed in forums and podcasts. Though the attention had mercifully died down over the years, the apartment above the shop had remained sealed all this time, preserved like a museum of an interrupted life. Mrs. Kellerman had tried to rent it out twice, but both tenants had broken their leases within months, complaining of strange sounds and an unsettling feeling of being watched. "It's like someone's still living up there," the second tenant had said, returning the keys with shaking hands. After that, Mrs. Kellerman had simply left the apartment alone, paying the utilities and checking on it periodically, but otherwise letting it exist in its state of suspended animation. She told herself it was out of respect for Elena, but the truth was more complicated. Sometimes late at night when she was closing up the shop, she could swear she smelled cooking, not the musty odor of abandonment, but the rich, complex aromas of a kitchen in use. She had never told anyone about the smells, just as she had never mentioned the soft sounds that sometimes drifted down through the ceiling, the gentle clink of dishes, the whisper of pages turning, the faint scratch of a pen moving across paper. Mrs. Kellerman was a practical woman who had no patience for ghost stories, but she couldn't deny what her senses told her. The truth about the apartment's continuing mystery might have remained hidden forever, if not for a water leak in the spring of 2017. A pipe had burst in the wall between the apartment and the shop, forcing Mrs. Kellerman to finally enter the space she had avoided for so long. She climbed the stairs with her heart pounding, key trembling in her hand, preparing herself for the confrontation with 9 years of dust and decay. Instead, she found an apartment that looked as if it had been recently occupied. The air was fresh, not stale. The plants on the windowsill were green and healthy, their soil moist. The kitchen was spotless, with dishes drying in the rack and a faint warmth emanating from the oven that suggested recent use. But most shocking of all was the notebook on the counter, the same notebook that Elena had left open to her final shopping list, except now it was filled with page after page of recipes written in Elena's unmistakable handwriting. Mrs. Kellerman's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading recipe after recipe for dishes she had never heard of, and some she remembered from Rosemary's kitchen. The handwriting was definitely Elena's. She had seen it countless times on rent checks and grocery lists, but the ink looked fresh, as if it had been written recently. Some pages were dated, starting from just a few months after Elena's disappearance and continuing right up to the present day. The recipes themselves were extraordinary. They weren't just lists of ingredients and instructions, they were stories told through food. Each one included detailed notes about technique, personal observations about flavor combinations, and sometimes brief glimpses into the emotional context of the dish. "This soup is for the days when silence feels too heavy," read one entry. "The broth carries more than flavor. It carries the weight of unspoken words." Mrs. Kellerman found herself reading for hours, completely absorbed in this impossible chronicle. Here was a recipe for comfort bread for the grieving, with notes about how the rhythm of kneading could help process loss. There was a detailed description of memory stew, designed to evoke specific childhood experiences through carefully chosen spices. Page after page revealed not just culinary expertise, but a deep understanding of how food could heal emotional wounds. But who was writing these recipes? The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been living there. Mrs. Kellerman was the only one with a key, and she was certain she would have noticed if someone had been coming and going. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Someone had been using this kitchen, caring for these plants, filling this notebook with recipes that seemed to come from a place of profound understanding about the connection between food and the human heart. As she continued reading, Mrs. Kellerman discovered that many of the recipes were specifically designed for healing. Anxiety-soothing chamomile cookies included detailed notes about how the act of measuring and mixing could serve as a form of meditation. Loneliness-banishing soup came with instructions for making extra portions to share with neighbors. It was as if Eleanor, or whoever was writing these recipes, had been studying the town's emotional needs and crafting culinary solutions. The most recent entry, dated just 2 weeks prior, was particularly intriguing. It was titled Recipe for Finding What Was Lost, and included ingredients that seemed more metaphorical than literal. 1 cup of patience, aged slowly, 2 tablespoons of hope, freshly ground, a pinch of faith measured by heart rather than scale. The instructions were equally enigmatic. Combine ingredients with gentle hands. Allow to rest in quiet contemplation. Serve when the time is right. Mrs. Kellerman sat in Elena's kitchen as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, trying to make sense of what she had discovered. Every rational part of her mind rejected the possibility that Elena had somehow been writing these recipes from beyond the grave, or that she had been living secretly in the apartment all these years. But the evidence was there in black and white, in handwriting she recognized as surely as her own. She thought about the sounds she had heard over the years, the smells that had drifted down through the ceiling, the persistent feeling that the apartment was still inhabited. Had her intuition been right all along? Was Elena somehow still here, still cooking, still caring for the community she had served? Or was there a more earthly explanation? Could Elena have faked her disappearance, living in secret while maintaining her connection to the town through these recipes? But why would she do such a thing? And how could she have remained hidden for 9 years in a place as small and observant as Millbrook? As evening approached, Mrs. Kellerman made a decision that would change everything. Instead of calling the police or sharing her discovery with anyone else, she carefully returned the notebook to its place on the counter. She would watch and wait, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was responsible for this mystery. But first, she would try making one of the recipes herself. If Elena, or whoever was writing these recipes, had been studying the town's needs, perhaps Mrs. Kellerman could understand their message by following their instructions. She chose a simple recipe titled Bread for New Beginnings, noting that it called for ingredients she happened to have in her own kitchen downstairs. That night, for the first time in 9 years, the smell of baking bread filled the space above the antique shop. Mrs. Kellerman worked with Elena's recipe, following each instruction precisely, and as she kneaded the dough, she found herself thinking about all the questions that had haunted Millbrook since Elena's disappearance. Perhaps the time had come to start looking for answers. Mrs. Kellerman's first instinct was to call Sheriff Hayes to report what she had found and let someone else figure out the implications. But as she sat in her kitchen that evening, eating the bread she had made from Elena's impossible recipe, she found herself hesitating. The bread was perfect, better than anything she had ever made, and there was something about the process of creating it that had filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The recipe had been more than just instructions. It had been a form of therapy, a way of processing the confusion and loss that had marked the past 9 years. As she had kneaded the dough, following Elena's detailed notes about technique and timing, she had found herself thinking about all the ways her life had changed since the disappearance. The questions she had carried, the assumptions she had made, the grief she had never properly acknowledged for the loss of someone who had never really been hers to lose. By morning, Mrs. Kellerman had decided to keep the secret a little longer. She would continue to monitor the apartment, to watch for any sign of who might be responsible for the mysterious recipes, but she would also begin to understand them, to follow their guidance and see where they led. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Kellerman developed a routine. Each morning she would check the apartment for changes, noting any new recipes that had appeared in the notebook. Then she would select one to try, purchasing ingredients and following the instructions with the care of a researcher conducting an experiment. Each recipe taught her something new, not just about cooking, but about the subtle ways that food could influence emotion and memory. The Clarity soup helped her think more clearly about a difficult decision regarding her late husband's estate. The Patience cookies somehow made her more tolerant of difficult customers in the antique shop. The Courage casserole gave her the strength to finally call her estranged sister after 2 years of silence. Each dish seemed designed to address a specific need, as if someone had been watching her life unfold and crafting culinary solutions to her problems. But the most profound discovery came when Mrs. Kellerman began to notice patterns in the recipes that corresponded to events in the town. When the Morrison family was struggling with their teenage son's rebellion, a recipe for understanding stew appeared, with notes about how certain spices could promote empathy and communication. When old Mr. Thompson was hospitalized with pneumonia, a recipe for healing broth materialized, complete with instructions for preparing it in small, easily digestible portions. It was as if Eleanor, or whoever was writing these recipes, had been watching over Millbrook all these years, using food as a way to care for the community she had once served. The recipes weren't just random culinary experiments, they were responses to specific needs, crafted with the kind of intimate knowledge that only comes from years of careful observation. Mrs. Kellerman began to test this theory by sharing some of the recipes with people who seemed to need them. She made a batch of comfort cookies for Sarah Chen, the librarian, who had been struggling with her mother's dementia. She prepared reconciliation soup for the Hendersons, who had been feuding with their neighbors over a property line dispute. In each case, the recipe seemed to work in ways that went beyond simple nutrition, creating moments of connection and understanding that helped heal emotional wounds. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late May, when Mrs. Kellerman discovered that a new recipe had appeared overnight: Courage to Speak Truth cookies. The instructions were accompanied by a note written in Elena's handwriting. Sometimes the hardest recipe to follow is the one that requires us to share what we know. Mrs. Kellerman understood the message immediately. She had been keeping Elena's secret for weeks, watching the notebook fill with recipes while struggling with the ethical implications of her silence. The town deserved to know what she had found, but she also felt protective of the mystery, reluctant to expose it to the harsh light of official investigation. But the decision was taken out of her hands when Danny Morrison stopped by the antique shop that afternoon. Elena's former dishwasher had become a chef in his own right, working at a restaurant in Burlington, but he still visited Millbrook regularly to check on the friends he had made during his time at Rosemary's Kitchen. "Mrs. Kellerman," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I need to ask you something. Have you ever gone back into Elena's apartment?" The question caught her off guard. "Why do you ask?" Danny ran his hand through his hair, looking embarrassed. "This is going to sound crazy, but I've been having dreams about her. Not just regular dreams, but cooking dreams. She's teaching me recipes I've never heard of, showing me techniques I've never seen. And the weird thing is, they work. I've been making these dishes at the restaurant, and they're incredible. It's like she's still teaching me somehow." Mrs. Kellerman felt her heart racing. "Tell me about the dreams." "She's always in a kitchen that looks like her old apartment, but it's filled with light and warmth. She's writing in a notebook and she looks up at me and says, 'The recipes are ready. It's time to share them.' Then she hands me the notebook and I can see page after page of recipes written in her handwriting. When I wake up, I can remember every detail." Mrs. Kellerman made a decision that would change everything. She led Danny upstairs to Elena's apartment, unlocked the door, and showed him the notebook on the counter. His gasp of recognition was all the confirmation she needed. "This is it," he whispered, his fingers trembling as he touched the familiar handwriting. "This is exactly what I've been seeing in my dreams." "How is this possible?" Together they began to read through the recipes, and Danny's excitement grew with each page. He recognized techniques and flavor combinations that had appeared in his dreams, dishes that he had somehow known how to prepare without ever having learned them. But more than that, he began to understand the deeper purpose behind the recipes. "She's been taking care of people," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "All these years she's been finding ways to help the town, to give people what they need. Look at this recipe for healing soup. It appeared right after Mr. Thompson got sick. And this one for understanding stew, that's dated the same week the Morrison family was having all those problems with their son." Mrs. Kellerman nodded, sharing her own observations about the patterns she had noticed. Together, they began to piece together a theory that was both impossible and undeniable. Elena Rodriguez had somehow been using food as a form of long-distance healing, crafting recipes that addressed the specific emotional and spiritual needs of the people she had once served. But the biggest mystery remained: how was she doing it? And more importantly, where was she? The answer to that question would come sooner than either of them expected. As they sat in Elena's kitchen, reading through the recipes and trying to understand their significance, Danny noticed something that Mrs. Kellerman had missed. The most recent entry in the notebook wasn't a recipe at all. It was a message, written in Elena's careful handwriting and dated that very morning. "The time for secrets has passed. Tomorrow, when the sun sets behind Miller's Hill, come to the place where the old oak tree stands alone. Bring the notebook. Bring your questions. Bring your open hearts. It's time to finish what we started." Mrs. Kellerman and Danny looked at each other, both understanding that they had reached the end of one mystery and the beginning of another. Elena Rodriguez was still alive, still caring for Millbrook from the shadows, and tomorrow they would finally learn the truth about where she had been all these years. The old oak tree at Miller's Hill had been a landmark in Millbrook for as long as anyone could remember. It stood alone on the crest of the hill, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and time, its branches reaching toward the sky like prayers made solid. Local legend claimed it was over 200 years old, planted by the town's first settlers as a gathering place and a beacon for travelers. Mrs. Kellerman and Danny arrived at the oak tree 30 minutes before sunset, carrying the notebook and a mixture of anticipation and dread. The evening was warm for late May, with a soft breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass. They had debated whether to contact Sheriff Hayes or bring others with them, but something about Elena's message had suggested this was meant to be a private reunion. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they waited in the shadow of the ancient tree. Mrs. Kellerman found herself studying the bark, tracing the patterns left by decades of weather and growth, while Danny paced nervously, checking his watch every few minutes. "What if she doesn't come?" Danny asked, voicing the fear they both carried. "She'll come," Mrs. Kellerman replied, though she wasn't sure where her certainty came from. "She's been preparing for this for 9 years." As the sun touched the edge of Miller's Hill, they heard footsteps approaching through the tall grass. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving slowly but steadily up the slope. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about the way she walked, the careful placement of each step, the slight forward lean that spoke of years spent hurrying through restaurant kitchens. Elena Rodriguez looked older than her 43 years, her dark hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying heavy secrets. But her eyes were the same, warm and intelligent, with that peculiar quality of seeming to see straight through to the heart of things. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a cotton shirt, and a worn leather jacket that looked like it had traveled many miles. "Hello, Danny," she said, her voice exactly as they remembered it. "Hello, Mrs. Kellerman. Thank you for coming." For a moment, nobody moved. 9 years of questions and grief and mystery hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Then Danny stepped forward, his eyes bright with tears. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking, "where have you been? We thought you were dead. The whole town thought you were dead." Elena's smile was sad, but genuine. "I know. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. But I had to disappear for a while. I had to find a way to keep helping without being present. It's complicated." She gestured to a fallen log near the oak tree, and the three of them sat down as the sun continued its descent. Eleanor looked out over the valley where Millbrook nestled like a child's toy village, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "I suppose you want to know why I left," she said. "We want to know everything," Mrs. Kellerman replied. "But first, we need to know how. How have you been writing recipes in your old apartment? How did you know exactly what people needed? How have you been taking care of the town from wherever you've been?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "My grandmother used to tell me that food was the most powerful form of love," she began, "not just because it nourishes the body, but because it carries intention. Every meal prepared with care, every recipe passed down through generations, every dish made with love, they all carry something beyond their physical ingredients." She paused, pulling the notebook from Mrs. Kellerman's hands and holding it like a sacred text. "When I was growing up, my grandmother taught me that some people are born with a special gift. They can feel what others need, emotionally and spiritually, and they can craft food that addresses those needs. She called it cocina del alma, cooking of the soul." Danny leaned forward, fascinated. "So you're saying you can actually heal people with food?" "Not heal exactly," Elena corrected, "but comfort, yes. Guide, yes. Help people process emotions they can't quite name, yes. Food is memory, Danny, it's emotion, it's connection. When you eat something prepared with true intention, it can change how you feel, how you think, even how you see the world. Mrs. Kellerman was beginning to understand. That's why people always felt better after eating at your restaurant. That's why the town seemed happier, more connected when you were here. Eleanor nodded. Millbrook needed healing when I arrived. I could feel it in the way people moved, in the silences between conversations, in the loneliness that seemed to hang over everything like fog. So I started cooking for those needs, creating dishes that would help people connect with each other and with themselves. But why did you leave? Danny asked. You were helping people, you were making a difference. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. Because I was getting too attached. Because I was starting to believe that I could fix everything, heal everyone, make the world perfect through food. And that kind of thinking, it's dangerous. It makes you think you're more important than you are, more powerful than you should be. She stood up and walked to the oak tree, pressing her palm against its rough bark. I started having dreams about disaster, dreams where my cooking was hurting people instead of helping them, dreams where I was using my gift for selfish reasons, or where I was becoming so focused on being needed that I forgot to be human. So you disappeared, Mrs. Kellerman said. I ran, Elena admitted. I packed a bag and left in the middle of the night, thinking I could just start over somewhere else. But I couldn't stop thinking about Millbrook, about all the people who had become like family to me. I couldn't just abandon them completely. Danny was staring at her in amazement. So you found a way to keep cooking for them from a distance? Elena turned back to face them, her expression a mixture of pride and exhaustion. It took me 2 years to figure out how to do it. I had to learn to project my intentions across space, to write recipes that would carry my energy and understanding to the people who needed them. It's not magic, exactly. It's more like concentrated empathy. She explained how she had been living in a series of small towns across the country, working as a traveling chef and food consultant, never staying in one place long enough to form the deep connections that had overwhelmed her in Millbrook. But every night, she would sit down with paper and pen and focus her thoughts on the town she had left behind, feeling for the emotional currents that flowed through its streets and homes. I could sense when someone was grieving, when families were struggling, when the community needed comfort, she said. And I would write recipes that I knew would help, recipes that carried the same intention I used to put into my cooking at the restaurant. Somehow those recipes would appear in my old notebook in my old kitchen. I never understood how it worked, only that it did. Mrs. Kellerman shook her head in wonder. We found evidence that someone had been in the apartment. The plants were watered, the kitchen was clean. How do you explain that? Elena's smile was mysterious. Love finds a way, Mrs. Kellerman. When you care deeply enough about something, when your intention is pure enough, sometimes the universe conspires to help you. I think my grandmother would have called it a miracle. I prefer to think of it as the natural consequence of refusing to let distance destroy connection. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. This is my real recipe collection, she said, holding it out to them. Every dish I've ever created, every technique I've learned, every secret my grandmother shared with me. I want you to have it, Danny. You're ready now to carry on this work. Danny took the book with reverent hands, feeling the weight of generations of culinary wisdom. But what about you? Are you coming back? Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the twinkling lights of Millbrook. I've been running for 9 years, she said finally. Running from my gift, from the responsibility it carries, from the fear that I might do more harm than good. But I'm tired of running. I'm tired of caring for people from a distance. And I think Millbrook is ready for me to come home. The news of Elena Rodriguez's return spread through Millbrook like ripples across still water. Mrs. Kellerman and Danny had agreed to keep the details of her disappearance private, sharing only that she had been dealing with personal matters and was now ready to come home. Some residents accepted this explanation with the polite discretion that small towns are famous for, while others whispered questions they were too respectful to ask directly. Elena moved back into her apartment above the antique shop on a quiet Tuesday morning in early June. Mrs. Kellerman had spent days preparing the space, cleaning and organizing, but when Elena climbed those familiar stairs for the first time in 9 years, she found that everything was exactly as she had left it. The notebook still sat on the counter, now filled with the impossible recipes she had written from hundreds of miles away. The plants her distant care had somehow kept alive rustled softly in the morning breeze from the open windows. "It's like no time has passed at all," Elena murmured, running her fingers along the worn wooden countertop where she had prepared so many meals. But time had passed, and Elena could feel the changes in herself and in the town below. She was older, more cautious, carrying the weight of 9 years of deliberate isolation. Millbrook, too, had evolved in her absence. New families had moved in, old residents had passed away, and the rhythms of daily life had shifted in subtle but significant ways. The question that everyone was asking, though few voiced it directly, was whether Elena would reopen Rosemary's Kitchen. The storefront on Main Street had been empty for the past year, its windows papered over with local advertisements and community notices. Danny had been urging her to reclaim the space, but Elena hesitated, uncertain whether the town was ready for her particular brand of healing through food. The answer came in an unexpected way. 3 days after her return, Eleanor was walking through the town square when she encountered Mrs. Patterson, one of her former regular customers. The elderly woman stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes filling with tears. "Eleanor," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. "Is it really you?" "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," Elena replied gently. "Yes, it's really me." What happened next surprised everyone, including Elena herself. Mrs. Patterson threw her arms around the younger woman, hugging her with the desperate intensity of someone reuniting with a long-lost daughter. "We missed you so much," Mrs. Patterson sobbed. "You don't understand what it was like after you left. The town, it just wasn't the same. People stopped gathering, stopped talking to each other. It was like the heart went out of everything." Eleanor held the older woman, feeling the depth of grief and loss that her disappearance had caused. She had known intellectually that people would miss her, but she hadn't fully understood the emotional impact of her absence until this moment. Her departure hadn't just closed a restaurant, it had broken something essential in the community's spirit. Word of the encounter spread quickly, and by evening a small crowd had gathered outside the antique shop. They weren't demanding or aggressive, they simply stood quietly on the sidewalk, as if their presence could somehow communicate what words couldn't. Elena watched them from her window, recognizing faces that had aged and changed, seeing new faces mixed in with the familiar ones. Danny appeared at her door that evening, carrying a box of vegetables from the local farmer's market. "I thought you might want to cook," he said simply. Eleanor looked at the fresh produce, tomatoes still warm from the sun, basil with its leaves bright and fragrant, onions that promised to caramelize into sweetness. Her hands moved automatically, selecting ingredients, planning combinations, feeling the familiar stirring of creative energy that had been dormant for too long. "Help me carry these downstairs," she said. They set up a makeshift kitchen in the empty storefront, using portable burners and borrowed equipment. Elena moved through the space with muscle memory intact, her hands finding the perfect rhythm of chopping and stirring. She made a simple soup, tomato and basil with a hint of cream, but she prepared it with the same intentional care she had always brought to her cooking. As the aroma began to drift into the street, the small crowd outside grew larger. Elena could see faces pressed against the windows, could feel the collective hope that seemed to emanate from the gathering. Without consulting anyone, she began ladling soup into disposable cups and passing them through the door. The first person to taste Elena's cooking after 9 years was Sarah Chen, the librarian. As the warm soup touched her lips, her eyes closed and she made a small sound of recognition and pleasure. "It's exactly like I remembered," she said, her voice thick with emotion. One by one, members of the community stepped forward to receive their cup of soup. Eleanor watched their faces as they tasted what she had prepared, seeing the way their expressions softened, the way their shoulders relaxed, the way they began to turn toward each other with renewed openness. This was what she had missed most during her years of exile, the immediate, tangible impact of feeding people with love and intention. The impromptu soup distribution lasted until well past midnight, with people sharing cups and stories, reconnecting with neighbors they hadn't spoken to in months. Elena moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and words of welcome, feeling herself being woven back into the fabric of the community she had never really left. Sheriff Hayes appeared near the end of the evening, approaching Elena with the careful manner of someone who had carried questions for a very long time. "Eleanor," he said, "I know this isn't the time or place, but I have to ask, are you ready to tell me where you've been?" Eleanor looked at the sheriff, a good man who had spent years searching for answers that she hadn't been ready to provide. "I was finding my way back home," she said simply. "It just took longer than I expected." Hayes studied her face, perhaps recognizing that some mysteries were more important to preserve than to solve. "Will you be staying this time?" Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she had fed, comforted, and loved in her own quiet way. "Yes," she said with certainty she hadn't felt in years. "I'm home to stay." The crowd gradually dispersed, but the energy Elena's return had generated continued to pulse through Millbrook, long after the last cup of soup had been consumed. For the first time in 9 years, people went to bed feeling full in a way that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with the restoration of something essential they hadn't even realized they'd lost. In her apartment above the antique shop, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with the notebook that had served as her connection to Millbrook during the years of exile. She turned to a fresh page and began to write, "Recipe for coming home. Take 1 part courage, 1 part humility, and a generous measure of love. Combine with the forgiveness of friends and the warmth of familiar places. Serve immediately, while the heart is still open to possibility." Tomorrow she would begin the process of officially reopening Rosemary's Kitchen. There would be permits to obtain, equipment to purchase, staff to hire. But tonight, she simply sat in her restored kitchen, surrounded by the invisible threads that connected her to every person she had fed, every heart she had comforted, every soul she had nourished through the simple act of cooking with love. 6 months after Eleanor's return, Rosemary's Kitchen reopened on a crisp October morning, exactly 9 years to the day after her mysterious disappearance. The renovation had been a community effort, with local contractors donating labor, neighbors contributing equipment, and longtime customers funding the new fixtures through an informal collection that raised more money than anyone had expected. Elena stood in her restored kitchen, surrounded by gleaming pots and sharpened knives, feeling the weight of the years that had passed and the wisdom they had brought. Danny worked beside her as head chef, his skills honed by 9 years of training and the mysterious dreams that had connected him to Eleanor's distant guidance. The kitchen hummed with the kind of energy that comes from people doing work they love, preparing food with intention and care. The menu at the new Rosemary's Kitchen was both familiar and evolved. Elena had kept the dishes that had made the restaurant beloved, the tres leches cake that could heal heartbreak, the pozole that cured homesickness, the apple cinnamon bread that somehow made everything feel possible. But she had also added new creations, recipes developed during her years of traveling, dishes that reflected her expanded understanding of how food could serve as medicine for the soul. The reopening drew visitors from across Vermont and beyond. Food writers who had heard the story of the vanishing chef came expecting to debunk a small-town legend, and left as believers in the power of intention to transform simple ingredients into something transcendent. Customers who had discovered Elena's story online made pilgrimages to taste the food that was said to heal hearts and bring communities together. But the most important guests were the longtime residents of Millbrook, people who had carried the absence of Rosemary's Kitchen like a physical ache for 9 years. Mrs. Patterson was the first customer through the door, ordering her usual Tuesday lunch and weeping openly when the familiar flavors brought back memories of easier times. Sarah Chen claimed her old table by the window, bringing a new book and an old appetite for food that felt like a warm embrace. The Morrison family, now with grandchildren in tow, introduced Elena to the newest members of their clan, while sharing stories of how her recipes had helped them through difficult years. Even Sheriff Hayes stopped by, finally allowing himself to set aside the unsolved case file and simply enjoy a meal prepared by the woman who had taught him that some mysteries were more beautiful left intact. Elena moved through the dining room with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, but there was something different about her now. The haunted quality that had shadowed her eyes during her first incarnation at Rosemary's Kitchen had been replaced by a deep peace, the kind that comes from accepting both the power and the responsibility of one's gifts. "She's different," Mrs. Kellerman observed to Danny during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "Stronger somehow, like she's finally comfortable with who she is." Danny nodded, stirring a pot of the anxiety-soothing soup that had become one of the restaurant's most requested dishes. "She told me once that running away taught her the difference between serving people and trying to save them. She's not trying to fix everyone anymore, she's just trying to feed them well." The difference was subtle but profound. Elena still prepared each dish with extraordinary care, still seemed to know exactly what each customer needed before they ordered, still created food that addressed emotional as well as physical hunger. But there was less urgency in her movements, less desperation in her desire to help. She had learned to trust that people would find their own paths to healing, and that her role was simply to provide nourishment for the journey. As winter settled over Millbrook, Rosemary's Kitchen became more than just a restaurant. It became a gathering place where the community rediscovered its capacity for connection. Eleanor instituted weekly cooking classes where she taught residents to prepare simple versions of her healing recipes, sharing not just techniques, but the philosophy behind intentional cooking. "Food is love made visible," she would tell her students as they learned to knead bread or balance spices. "When you cook with care, when you consider not just flavor but feeling, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest forms of magic." The notebook that had mysteriously filled itself during Eleanor's absence became the foundation for a cookbook that Danny convinced her to write. The recipe book that wrote itself, Cooking for the Soul, became a bestseller, with proceeds donated to fund a scholarship program for aspiring chefs from small towns. Eleanor insisted that the book's dedication read simply, "For Millbrook, which taught me that home is not a place you find, but a choice you make every day." On a quiet evening in late spring, exactly 1 year after her return, Eleanor sat in her apartment above the antique shop, writing in a new notebook. The pages no longer filled themselves with mysterious recipes. That particular magic had ended when she came home. But she continued to write, documenting new dishes and techniques, recording observations about the connections between food and emotion, preserving the wisdom her grandmother had passed down, and the insights she had gained through her years of exile and return. Mrs. Kellerman knocked on the door, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the comfortable expression of someone who had found her place in an extraordinary story. "I brought you some of that chamomile blend you like," she said, settling into the chair across from Elena's small kitchen table. "Thank you," Elena replied, closing her notebook and accepting the steaming cup. "I was just writing about gratitude, about how the simplest recipes are often the most powerful." They sat in comfortable silence, two women who had weathered mystery and revelation, loss and return. Outside the window, Millbrook settled into evening, its lights twinkling like stars reflected in still water. "Do you ever think about leaving again?" Mrs. Kellerman asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I spent 9 years learning that you can't heal the world by running from it. Home isn't perfect, but it's where you're needed. It's where your particular gifts can do the most good." Below them, the restaurant was closed for the night, but Eleanor could still feel the warmth that lingered in its walls, the satisfaction that came from feeding people well, the deep contentment of work that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new opportunities to nourish and comfort, new chances to prove that love, properly seasoned, could indeed change the world one meal at a time. In her notebook, Elena had written the final recipe of the day. Ingredients for a life well lived, one generous portion of purpose mixed with equal parts compassion and persistence. Season with humility and let simmer in the warmth of community. Serve with gratitude and share with anyone who hungers for meaning. The recipe for Elena Rodriguez's new life was simple but profound. Stay present, cook with love, and trust that feeding people well is one of the most important things a human being can do. In Millbrook, Vermont, in a small restaurant called Rosemary's Kitchen, she had found her way to a kind of magic that required no mystery, just the daily choice to transform simple ingredients into something that could heal hearts, build community, and remind people that they were loved. Some stories end with answers to every question. Others end with the understanding that the most important truths can't be fully explained, only experienced. Eleanor's story was the latter kind, a tale of disappearance and return, of recipes that wrote themselves and love that transcended distance, of the extraordinary power hidden in the ordinary act of feeding someone who is hungry. The mystery of how Elena's recipes had appeared in her abandoned notebook would never be fully solved. The townspeople of Millbrook seemed content to accept it as one of those inexplicable gifts that occasionally grace ordinary lives, proof that the universe sometimes conspires to help love find its way home. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.